Welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion on the Russia-Ukraine invasion. And joining me is Clint Ehrlich, foreign policy analyst, lawyer, and former visiting researcher at Moscow State Institute on International Relations. Clint, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so how did we get here? How did Russia come to the point where it has now essentially invaded Ukraine?
This really goes back to 2008 when, under the Bush administration, there was pressure for NATO to declare that Ukraine would ultimately become a member of NATO. Russia had made it clear that that was a red line for Russia, but at the time, Russia didn't have the capability to do anything about it. And so we've really been walking closer and closer to this conflict as Russia made ultimatums, issued a draft treaty to the United States and to NATO, and those were ignored. And people like me warned that Russia was serious about taking military action, but those warnings weren't heeded. And now we find ourselves in the midst of the worst large-scale military conflict in Europe since World War II.
Well, I would argue also there was the big conflict, obviously, in Croatia and Bosnia. That was a large one. I just correct that because I know people keep saying there hasn't been any conflict in Europe since World War II, but that was a huge one. And as a half Croat, I have to point that out. But
I would say that the scale of the militaries involved in this conflict is large. And though the civilian casualties that occurred there were certainly horrifying, we didn't see a confrontation between militaries the size of the Ukrainian military and the Russian military.
Correct. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So when you mentioned, this sort of this climate of the red line started under the Bush administration, it blows my mind. That is so many presidents ago. We've had Bush, we've had Obama, we've had Trump, we've had now Biden. How did America just sit on the sidelines? And of course, we always look to America as, this kind of global police authority that will, enforce peace, if you will. How did America not do anything or not take note or not take this seriously?
Well, there was really an ideological difference between America and Russia. The Russians believed in something much closer to realpolitik, and the Americans had an ideological view of the world where abstract principles like the idea that NATO should have an open door were absolute and couldn't be compromised. And so when Russia drew this red line, the United States and its Western partners simply were unwilling to negotiate and to agree for Ukraine to not enter NATO, even though they didn't really want Ukraine in NATO. That's sort of the irony here, is that there were two paths that could have been walked. Either they could have walked back the declaration that Ukraine was going to join NATO, or they could have made Ukraine a member of NATO. And really both of those steps, either of them, would have avoided this catastrophe. And instead they did the one thing that could have led them to war, which was to refuse to say that Ukraine wouldn't be a member of NATO, but to also fail to offer a security guarantee to deter Russia. And so it's really a perfect storm leading us into the conflict, and one that makes you wonder if it wasn't in the interest of the United States to have Russia invade, sort of like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was harmful to the Soviet Union.
So, and we'll come to that in a moment. But just for our viewers' perspective, why is it so concerning to Russia to have Ukraine as a member of NATO? Why is that their red line?
Well, it's important to understand that Russia sees NATO as an anti-Russian military bloc, the same way that the West saw the Warsaw Pact countries during the Cold War. And in particular, Russia was worried about the placement of de facto NATO bases already in Ukraine, like the Yaroslav Training Center that it just blew up yesterday. And it was also worried about the placement of missiles on Ukrainian territory. The Russians contended that those missiles would be strategically destabilizing because the flight time to Moscow could be as short as 5 minutes, forcing Russia to adopt a launch on warning posture that could threaten nuclear war.
And that's why we've seen such, I guess, alarmism and rhetoric come out of Russia, because they really just don't want Ukraine part of NATO. This is, we're talking missiles at their border, and this is why perhaps we can see why this elevated posturing has taken place. So apart from the NATO concern, we know that America imports several hundred thousand barrels of oil every day from Russia. How has America's, could we say, dependence on Russian oil factored into this conflict?
America's dependence on Russian oil is relevant, but it's really primarily Europe's dependence on Russian gas that has been the bigger factor. America has an interest in exporting its liquid natural gas to Europe in order to compete with the Russian pipelines that ship natural gas through Ukraine to Germany. And so there's really an argument to be had here that it's in the economic interest of the United States to have this conflict, precisely because it disrupts the supply of the competing gas, which can be provided at a lower price point than American exports. And so that's one of the reasons that I think that the United States has not done everything that it could to avoid this conflict, because there is a real economic benefit to America from exporting that gas at prices that otherwise would not be able to fetch on the open market.